reading is something that you can do at any time. You don't need to book a language lesson. You don't need to travel to the country. You can literally just grab a book on the train and start reading. The real purpose of reading is not so much to understand every little word, but it's to be able to understand the longer flow of how language is put together, of how phraseology works in language, how you express ideas, how you get meaning across. Not only could they all speak English, but a lot of them could speak each other's languages too, and I just found that utterly fascinating. And it made me feel completely and utterly insignificant. That was the moment when I vowed to myself, right, I'm going to learn a language, and I started learning French. My life has been shaped by the languages that I've learned.
This is the Language Podcast, and I'm Richard Simcott. On the show today, we have Olly Richards, inventor of the StoryLearning method. In this series, we're giving you the tools you need to start learning a language. Today, we're discussing reading. If you want to get really good at a language, you can't afford to be illiterate in it. Books often go deeper into a language than any other resource at your disposal. So while reading likely won't be your first port of call, it absolutely needs to be part of your language learning practice. The trouble is, the idea of reading can be daunting. On the one hand, it reminds a lot of people of school textbooks, which often prioritize the rules of the language over having fun. Then there are people who are learning a language with a different writing system, like Chinese or Arabic. When you have to memorize brand new characters, it can feel like an impossible task. That's why I've brought Olly Richards onto the show for a bit of help. We've worked together on various projects in the past, and he brings a wealth of knowledge that I know you're going to get value from today. He's the brains behind StoryLearning, a method which teaches reading skills through stories, using the same natural learning process children use to learn their native language. So let's dive in. Olly, first of all, thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. You've really taken the sort of the reading thing quite far in terms of the work you've put into putting together these books that help people to learn languages. Can you start by giving some background on reading skills and the importance of them?
Reading skills are something that often I feel like it gets overlooked in language learning, mostly because I think when people start to want to learn a new language, it's often because they want to speak, and it's often because they want to travel, they want to communicate with somebody. But then one of the big problems with learning to speak a new language is that you can't be speaking it all the time. And so people often fixate on how can I get better at speaking? But of course, that takes a very long time to do, and it requires many hours, weeks, months, years of practice. And so where reading skills really comes into the equation is that reading is something that you can do at any time. You don't need to book a language lesson. You don't need to travel to the country. You can literally just grab a book on the train and start reading. And so, much like listening, although there are significant differences, reading is one of these things that even without making any claims about the effectiveness of reading as a language learning tool, the very fact that you can do it anywhere, very easily, with no barrier, makes it an incredibly important tool in the box. So that's really where it fits in from my perspective. But it also has a lot of very specific advantages as a mode of study. Speaking and listening all happen in real time, which is great for practice, but it's not very convenient as a study mode because you either miss something. There's no rewind button in real life. There is with listening, but it's just not very convenient. There's a real benefit to seeing a page full of words from a second moment by moment study perspective, because you can scan back and forward, you can read and reread, you can look at you can look at the whole sentence to help you understand the meaning of a word. It is the most practical, convenient method or tactic that there is really for actually getting familiar with and processing language. So it's extremely powerful. But I think the final point to make, and this is where I think people often run into trouble with reading, is they think, because it does make intuitive sense. I'm learning French. Let's read in French. Great, but One of the interesting quirks of reading in a second language is that all the skills that you have as a reader in your native language do not transfer over to the foreign language. So you kind of set about reading the way that you would in English, but you don't do that in the same way in a foreign language. And so you have to learn to read from scratch, as it were. So it's very, very, very useful, very wide-ranging, very impactful tool.
What do you think people need to think about first and foremost when it comes to reading in a new language?
One of the things that is extremely important to get right, it's kind of the thing that really, if you get this wrong, everything else just collapses like a house of cards. But the most important thing at the beginning is to make sure that when you do read, it's at a level where you understand enough of the text to actually get meaning from it. The kind of classic mistake that everyone makes, I remember doing this myself when I lived in Paris. I remember going to one of those fantastic Parisian bookshops and sort of browsing, and I thought, okay, I'll just read a few novels in French, and that'll help me learn. So I remember grabbing some Molière or whatever it was, and then going to a cafe, sitting down, starting to read, and of course I didn't get beyond the first page because it's just too difficult, far too dense, didn't understand any of the words. And this is everyone's first experience with reading in a foreign language. I love the idea, great in theory, not so great in practice. And so step number one is actually choosing material that is comprehensible. And typically that means that ideally you will already understand most of what's on the page. And this confuses people a little bit because you think, well, that's too easy. But the real purpose of reading, for me, is not so much to understand every little word, but it's to be able to understand the longer flow of how language is put together, of how phraseology works in language, how you express ideas, how you get meaning across. And so ideally we want to be reading at a level where we can already understand a good chunk of what's on the page, because that then allows us to start to notice all the other details. And that's how we improve.
Let's just sort of break this down a little bit further and say, if somebody's looking at books and thinking, okay, I want to be able to read something I enjoy reading in my own language, or maybe I've learnt another language and I like reading in that language too, but maybe it was a language they had at school. Is there kind of a way to start? Do they need to get to a certain level in the language first? Are there always going to be readers available, things that they can read? And if so, how many words can they not understand on a page? How much is kind of okay to say, do you know what, I don't need to worry about that, I'll just carry on?
In general, my belief is that to really read and get the full benefits from reading, you do need to have some level in the language. And for me, I think the benefits really start at around intermediate level. The reason being that before that, you just simply don't understand enough, and you're just forever looking up words and ask, what does that word mean? What does this word mean? You're doubting the grammar, and it's just too slow. So I think the benefits for reading really kick in after intermediate level. Ideally, I would say that we want to be understanding at least around 70-80% of what's already on the page.
Okay.
Potentially even higher than that. But that's very theoretical, because in practice, you can't just walk into a bookshop and pick up a book that happens to be at exactly 85% comprehension for you. So we're always working in a non-perfect situation. And so from there, the question I would always ask is, well, what are you interested in? Because if you're interested in something and it's a bit hard for you, maybe that's okay, because your motivation will kind of pull you through. So those are the kind of broad brushstrokes, but that doesn't mean that you should then not start reading until you get to intermediate level. What that means for me is that at the lower levels, you want to be choosing material that is very much written for learning. And at the beginning, this could be very simple dialogues in your textbook. Everything from the simple "Hello, how are you? I'm fine, thanks. And you?" All that stuff. I mean, that is reading, albeit dull as dishwater, but it is reading. And then from there, you can find texts that are written for learners. They might appear in your textbook. You might be able to find them from an app online or something. Whether they are little dialogues or little stories or whatever you can get your hands on. There is quite a lot of stuff out there. You can start to read material that is written for beginners. I think you just have to accept that it's not going to be very interesting. And then you have to kind of have this mindset of, well, let's keep doing it. Let's plow through. And then, you'd be surprised how quickly your comprehension starts to increase. And it really is like a floodgate situation, because as soon as you get used to reading and you do more of it, then, the day comes when, you really can understand a lot more than you thought was possible.
Yeah, I suppose so. What you're really hinting at is it's looking for things that will at least be approachable, but possibly interesting, but not to have your hopes too high in the beginning. I mean, my own experience of this has been where teachers, or I myself just studying my own language, especially if the language doesn't really have many learning materials, has been looking at understanding, say, just sort of the main heading texts of news articles, or things that are written that you just want to understand what the question is, or what the it's kind of whatever it's related to, just to kind of almost have that very quick and easy win, even if it is looking up the words, just to kind of think, I've actually got through to something. And there will definitely be people I know listening to this thinking, well, I go through and I peruse all of the books to read stories, but I don't see the languages necessarily that I'm interested in. Maybe it's because it's a home language that doesn't have many learning materials for second language learners, or people who are claiming or reclaiming a heritage language, for example. These are all things that can happen, I guess. But one thing people do talk to me about and ask me about a lot, and I'm sure you get this question too, what about children's books? Do you think we should start with those?
My general feeling is no, for a variety of reasons. Children's books are not interesting for adults to read. They're not motivating, unless you perhaps want to, there was one book that you particularly loved as a kid. But I follow this with my daughter. I look at the books that she reads and has read from an early age up until now, and the language that you tend to get in children's books is very it's not the kind of stuff that you as an adult typically need to learn. I mean, if you take your kind of random spread of Julia Donaldson books, Gruffalos and Superworms and Owl Ice Cream and things like that. I mean, on the spectrum of things that you would like to learn today to get better at a language, that doesn't really figure as part of it. So I think there's a general misconception that children's books are easy. They're not easy. They are very particular. And personally, what I like to do is I would never go near a children's book. I would much rather use learning materials from a textbook, for example, that includes some dialogues or stories, and even though they're not particularly interesting, use that, because at least it's been written to include the kind of things that at my level it would be useful to learn.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that about weird words in children's books, because it sort of reminds me of people who go to Harry Potter, for example, and read that in different languages because of the translation, right, of the language. And I always thought, well, how on earth do you know it's privet drive and not private drive? For example, with the pronunciation, if you've not heard the word, how on earth do you know? Is this something you've come across in other languages, and what do you think we should do about it?
Ultimately, the thing that you do is the thing that's going to get you results. It's like going to what's better, running, cycling, or weightlifting. I mean, there are technical answers, but ultimately the form of exercise that you actually do every day is going to be the thing that's best for you. So, I think I don't worry too much about the details, because I'm just always asking myself, how can I find that thing that I'm sufficiently interested in to show up and do it every day? Because then over the longer term you'll figure these things out.
When you sort of think about a text that's, say, longer and you want to understand it, and it maybe feels like there's a lot there, I mean, how many words would you look up? And is there kind of a rule even for that, as to when you would start to think, okay, really now I need to stop looking up these words? Because when does that point come?
It's a great question. Everyone always looks for. I always get questions looking for the exact ratio of words I should be looking up per sentence, and of course there's no really good answer for that. But so I think it's helpful to think about the two different forms of reading that you commonly get, or that are commonly discussed in teaching worlds, and that is intensive reading versus extensive reading. And understanding these different behaviors is useful for thinking about why you might choose to read in the first place and what you'd expect to get from it. So to start off with intensive reading, as the name suggests, that's where you're reading very intensively, meaning you're looking to understand every word in the sentence, the meaning of every sentence, and exactly what nuances might be hidden inside. This is the kind of reading that's mostly done in language classrooms. So imagine the teacher comes out and has a half-page newspaper article, and they say, right, class, today we are going to read this short article about cats, and we're going to understand exactly why it is that Siberian cats grow large, thick fur coats in winter, and then why they shed them in early spring. And you're like, okay, cool. Now, in order to understand this, you've really got to understand every word in this little article. Which means if the word you don't know, you'll be looking them up in the dictionary. If there's grammar that you don't understand, you'll be talking about that grammar. And teachers often use intensive reading as a teaching tool. So they'll say, right, okay, what I need to do today is teach my students about cats. So let's find an article that we can read that has a bunch of stuff about cats in it. Now, the fact that an article appears in the classroom makes everyone think, right, great, we're doing reading. Today's a reading lesson, but actually it's not a reading lesson. It's a vocabulary lesson. You're learning words. It just so happens that you're doing it from an article. You could do it from a YouTube video or from talking. So in this situation, yes, you're actually reading, but that's by the by. What you're actually doing is a very intensive form of particular study with a defined learning outcome. By the end of 60 minutes, I will have read and understood 10 new words about cats.
And so that basically you're seeing this intensive reading as being part and parcel of the overall language learning, I guess. Like, people normally think of them all as separate things, but actually what you're describing is this is an integrated element, this intensive reading that you're talking about.
I think it falls under the category of language instruction, where there is a deliberate, defined aim for the lesson, and we're going to use different tools and techniques to make this particular learning happen. But the opposite of this is what's called extensive reading typically. And with extensive reading, the goal, rather than trying to understand every word in the sentence, is rather to say, the benefit will come from reading this entire book or this entire chapter. And we don't even need to know what exactly we will learn from reading this book or this chapter, because we just know as a point of principle that if we are reading lots and lots in the language, we will learn a bunch of stuff, and it's going to be good stuff because that's the stuff that's there in the actual book itself. And so extensive reading is more of a habit and more of a philosophy, a general belief in the way of studying. So when you do that, then, which comes back to your original question, what's the aim? Because you're right, when you read extensively, you're not going to understand every word. What's crucial is to understand that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you don't know the word for coat, as in a coat of fur. First time you see it, you won't have a clue. But after you've read an entire chapter of a book about Siberian cats, you'll figure out that there is something about cats that gets longer and then falls off and then is fluffy and furry and nice. And eventually you'll guess, oh, they must be talking about that thing, the coat of fur. You will infer and deduce and figure out by yourself all of these things. And so the general rule of thumb is that you should be reading for gist, which means reading to understand the basic message of the text. And when it comes to looking up words, I remember our mutual friend Alex saying once that he has a rule where he would only look up a word if it appears 5 times in the same text. And I always thought that was great, because guess what? If a word appears 5 times, it's probably quite important.
Yeah.
And so it's probably worth looking up. But on the whole, you're not looking up that many words. You're focusing on trying to understand the gist of what you're reading and just following enough of the message for it to be meaningful for you. And then you trust that around the edges of all of that, your brain will start to soak up a lot of things. One of the questions I often get is, should you read aloud? What's the value of reading aloud? And I have quite strong views on this, but my view on this is that reading aloud, so, looking at a book of short stories and reading them out loud, literally, is almost entirely a waste of time.
Okay.
For reading, if the aim is to actually read and take in the material, I see zero value in reading aloud.
Mm-hmm. For reading.
For reading,
mm-hmm.
where there is value would be for, say, practicing pronunciation, or for example, I don't know, perhaps you're rehearsing a speech and you want to practice the intonation or the prosody, and you're just doing this muscle training of just experiencing what it's like to read something aloud. There is value, but there you're not practicing reading anymore. You're practicing something different. So for reading itself, I see no value.
What you're saying about that now, about reading aloud, for example, like as a script that you're reading for reproduction in front of other people and an audience, maybe, it really reminds me of the memory technique of writing an entire thing out that you want to learn to say, and then getting so used to saying it when you read it, you then start writing just the beginning letters until the words just automatically come and you see just a few letters on the page in a certain order.
I've never done that. That's really interesting. But I could see why that would work. But I remember when I lived in I've used this quite a few times early on at the beginning of a new language. I would often do things like write out a self-introduction. The kind of thing that you're going to have to use every time you meet someone new. I'd write it out, and I get someone to correct it, and then I'd practice it, and I'd make it really natural. And I think that's a fantastic exercise because it just gives you, I call this glimpses of mastery. It gives you a little window into what it's like to speak the language fluently, even though you're at an early stage. But again, this is kind of we're not even we're not even remotely near the topic of reading at this point. It's a completely different thing. But yeah.
No, but there is kind of an element of reading it, because I mean, if you think you're reading and rehearsing and memorizing something for the purposes of actually using it over and over again repeatedly, and I guess the link that I would sort of see there would be when you've been through or cycled through a certain number of words, like the most common words, then it becomes easier then to recognize them immediately and do this kind of sight reading that people talk about. You just see the word and you don't actually see the individual letters or sounds. You see almost like a concept, right? And
yes.
If you see what on a page, you don't even think about what. You just see it because it's so common. There is a couple of things that spring to mind from that, though, that thought. People talk about learning a base number of words in a language, like the most commonly used words. Do you think there's any value in doing that in any other way except reading?
I think it's an interesting idea to say, okay, I'm starting a new language tomorrow. The first thing I'm going to do is learn the 100 most frequent words, and I'm just going to memorize them by brute force. I can see why that would be useful. There are many language learning methods that people promote which take this kind of approach, like how to hack your way through a language by learning the 100 most common words. I think it's valid. The fact of the matter is that if all you did was just go off and read, you'd learn those same 100 words anyway in a few days or in a week. A lot of these approaches and tactics are kind of they're useful for how can you speed up the very, very initial stages, but they just don't get you very far because fundamentally there's so much you have. People drastically underestimate the amount of stuff you have to know in a language, and you cannot do it through any form of memorization. Not enough hours in the day, years in the life to approach that through memory. And but more to the point, you have to what it means to know a word is far deeper than just memorizing something. It's much more about understanding the context in which that word can be used. So I think it's fine, but it's not a language learning method that can scale much beyond those early stages.
There was an Australian, I believe, or New Zealand, I can't remember which country, and the man basically learnt the Scrabble dictionary in French and went to compete in a Scrabble competition in France and won. And all he'd done is learnt all of the words, basically how they could be used and combined. But he never learnt to speak French, was how the story went. And it just kind of goes to show that, yeah, you can use brute force memorization, but does that necessarily translate into an ability to speak or even read or understand the language? Apparently not.
But there is a divide that comes down between people who have actually learned languages and understand really just the scope of what's involved. And then it's almost like the kind of pop culture version of language learning, where certain things make intuitive sense. Like, of course, rote memorization makes sense. How else are you going to learn the words? And, of course, grammar exercises are a good thing because you've got to learn the rules, right? And I think there's an inherent difficulty for when people are learning a new language for the first time and haven't been through that process. You can't see what's on the other side. You can't see what's coming, and so all you really have to work with is the same part of the brain that is used to learning facts, historical dates, scientific equations from school. But language learning is so different from that, and I think it's just not really appreciated more widely. Just how much you have to take a holistic approach to learning a language.
What you just said now about the additional things that are necessary for language learning, and also something you mentioned just about maybe 5 minutes ago in this conversation was about Japanese and reading in Japanese. Obviously, there are people who are going to be listening to this thinking, well, actually, I want to learn a language that uses a very different writing system to the ones we see using Latin script. What kind of implications are there in the whole process of reading when it comes to learning these languages that have got very different scripts?
I love the way you phrase that question, because it is all about implications. It's understanding your choices and what they actually mean. Let's spell this out very, very plainly. If you're learning Spanish, then from day one, you can read a word and pronounce it. Might not be 100% accurate in all cases, but pretty much. There's a connection between the way that the language looks with its Latin alphabet and the pronunciation. Now, if you go to a language like Japanese, where there are 3 different writing systems, and 2 of them are actually not particularly hard to learn, but the third one, kanji, is very hard. There are thousands of characters to learn. There is no hack or cheat code or method that will mean that you can learn to read Japanese as easily as Spanish. There is no comparison. You have to do a huge amount of work to learn the Chinese characters necessary to be able to understand what you're reading. There simply is no shortcut. If you accept that it is a huge amount of work, then within that, there are ways that you can do it slower and faster. Mm-hmm. So if you're particularly good at certain forms of studying, perhaps if you have a very visual memory, if you are very analytical and can break down all the radicals and the different component parts, and there are people that teach this, and it's extremely valid. I mean, it's fine, but it's still a huge amount of work. There are the number of Chinese characters in daily use in Japanese is around 2,200, give or take. In traditional Chinese, there's more. There's that many thousands more. And so whichever way you skin the cat, you have to, the implication, to use the word from your question, is that you will need to be prepared to spend years of your life, most likely, and it is in the years, learning and memorizing these Chinese characters. And there is no way around that, short of you being particularly good with, memory techniques or just learning and memorizing vast amounts of information. Now, when it comes to reading, it gets interesting because it means that on the whole, reading meaningfully is a lot more difficult. In our books of short stories that we publish with Teach Yourself, we have different levels. We have intermediate, we have a beginner, and we have intermediate. And one of the things that people have noticed is that if you, for example, if you look at the stories from the beginner Spanish book, it is the same set of stories that we use for the intermediate Japanese book. And so we have the European languages, for example, fit into this category. Those same stories then are used for the intermediate versions of languages like Japanese, Korean, and Arabic. Why is that? It's because that if you want to read even a fairly simple story in Japanese or Korean or Arabic, the cognitive load, straight up difficulty of seeing so many different characters, alphabet, scripts in a different language means you're just going to get a lot. First of all, you probably don't even know what half of them are because you haven't learned them yet, but also you get a lot tireder because it's just really, really hard work. And so our essential approach to our series of short stories, which I'm using because it's a useful illustration of the real world implication of this, is that it is only really possible to read something meaningful in harder languages like Japanese once you're at the intermediate level, because before that point you just don't know enough. You haven't learned enough characters, you haven't practiced enough, your mental map of the language isn't developed enough. So essentially you can't start until you're much further down the line, and it makes it a lot harder.
So really, I mean, if you're learning a new script, just add on a bit of extra time so that you can actually recognize things. Because I suppose the patterns aren't going to be as obvious either. Whereas even if you're learning another language that has the same script as you're used to or a very similar script, you may start recognizing patterns as they add on or change words slightly for new meaning.
I mean, I think there are patterns in other languages as well. I mean, in Chinese, for example, the more that you read, the more that you notice connections between words. So, to take the classic example, the radicals in Chinese characters, such as the three dashes that make up the water radical. If you see that on any character, you know it has something to do with water. So there are kind of cheat codes, and you do start to see patterns. But it's just generally, a lot more work, and it's a lot harder. But of course, it's interesting to think about this. But I'd hate to put people off, taking on a language that has a harder script like that, because ultimately, unless you are learning a language for purely utilitarian reasons, unless you're saying, okay, I'm going to learn a new language and I want to do it as fast as possible, so what's the easiest language, please? That case aside, the most rewarding part of learning a new language is the fact that you put in the effort and you struggle with it, and then you come out the other side and you have the benefits. Your life changes as a result of having learned that language. And whether it's an easy language that takes you 6 months or a hard language that takes you 6 years, shouldn't matter, because what we're trying to do is to get the. I'll speak for myself. My life has been shaped by the languages that I've learned, and a language like Japanese, for example, because I lived in Japan for 4 years. One of the harder languages I've learned for sure. It took a lot longer. It was a lot harder in general. I find it more fulfilling to have learned a difficult language like Japanese than my fourth Romance language, for example, which gets, it's never easy, but it's significantly easier to learn. You don't have the same feeling of accomplishment than having worked for years of your life at really mastering a difficult language. So it's interesting to think about the relative difficulty level of languages, but the right answer for which language you should learn is always the one that lights you up.
Love, travel, study, work, friendship, whatever your reason for wanting to learn a new language, Teach Yourself provides the tools you need. Choose from over 70 languages and teach yourself today. Listeners of the Language Podcast get a special 20% discount on Olly's short stories series and beginner's guidebooks. Go to teachyourself.com and use the code in the show notes. Rely on Teach Yourself, trusted by language learners for over 85 years. Olly, listening to you speaking, it makes me question, you've been through all of these different experiences learning different languages, and it's taken you on this journey to, first of all, starting with a blog, the I Will Teach You a Language blog, and getting into language learning. But can you think of a pivotal moment that really led you to this point for language learning?
So there have been pivotal moments in in my life that got me into language learning. And then that, over the course of 20 years, then led to me starting my blog, which was I Will Teach You a Language at first, and is now StoryLearning. And then, writing the books that I have and the courses and things like that. But it all began, there was really one very clear moment that it began for me. And I still remember it like it was yesterday. And I was 19 years old. I was living in London, and I just got a job in Cafe Nero, that wonderful high street stalwart. You can't walk down a high street in the UK today without, passing 10 Cafe Neros. But back in the day, it was brand new and very exciting. And I remember walking in on day one, and of the 10, 15 staff in the cafe, I was the only English person. And I noticed that not only could all of the staff there who were from Sweden, Japan, France, Spain, Italy, not only could they all speak English, but a lot of them could speak each other's languages too. And I just found that utterly fascinating. And it made me feel completely and utterly insignificant. And that was the moment when I vowed to myself, right, I'm going to learn a language. And I started learning French. It was right then. And of course, it took a long time from that point to learn French. And I ended up moving to Paris and, then coming back to London and learning more languages. But it all came from that initial, very human realization that there's a big wide world out there, and I am not a part. I'm not in the game. I'm not a contributing member to this big wide world. And for whatever reason, I found it extremely compelling and interesting enough to devote like the next 20 years to learning languages. I can't account for that. I don't know why I got into that and not football like all my other friends, or music or whatever. It just lit my fire, I suppose. And I, being the person I am, I kind of dove head first into that. But then I think big moments in my life after that were, so I spent many years learning languages myself, but then I became an English teacher, and I moved to Japan to teach English, and I became ultimately very highly qualified as a teacher. And I always felt when I started StoryLearning right back at the beginning, which is over almost 11 years ago now, it seems crazy to say it, but the thing that I felt that I had to offer was the fact that not only had I learned a lot of languages, but I'd also spent many years teaching languages, and I felt that gave me a way of talking about language learning that at the time online was not particularly common. I mean, these days you've got lots of people who are teaching languages and learning languages and making TikTok videos about it. But back then, you'll remember this, Richard. The blogosphere, as it was called back then, was a very very small place, and I felt like that. I really enjoyed teaching. I loved the English teaching, and I felt that the kind of ultimate expression of what I wanted to do was to teach not English necessarily. That wasn't really my passion, but to teach language, help other people learn languages, teach people how to learn languages, was kind of the logical extension. And I feel very fortunate that I was ready to do that at a time when the online world was just beginning to hit mainstream. And you had similar experiences with your multilingual videos that just captured the attention of the world. And I never had anything like that, but I had my little blog. And so it was really this kind of long straight line from realizing that there's a big world out there to learning languages to teaching languages, and then that all kind of ultimately came together in the blog.
You mentioned, from the blog, obviously you've built up StoryLearning, and can you tell us a little bit more about that method?
Sure. So, I mean, what StoryLearning does is attempts to take the power of reading in a foreign language and to make it accessible. One of the interesting things that we've talked about in this conversation is the fact that there's a lot of questions about reading, how to read. Like you can make it very complicated if you want to, and it can be very difficult and unstructured. And often what I find with students of ours is that the more questions and doubts you have, the harder it is to really commit to a course of action with language learning. Yeah. And so with StoryLearning, we offer very clear structured methods for learning a new language with reading. So we have our books are short stories, which are not really suitable for beginners, really, but for complete beginners, but are great for people who are just who want to practice. We often hear from people read these books, and then I'll get an email saying, I've just felt like I can understand French for the first time in my life. And this is someone who's been learning for 20 years. It creates an opportunity to really engage with and enjoy the language. And then with our courses, it's more for, if you're a complete beginner and you'd like to learn a language through stories, well, here's the complete pathway, the complete curriculum. And so we've really just built up a whole ecosystem of different materials for people to learn in this way. And it's not for everybody. Lots of people like learning in different ways. What seems to have happened is, for a certain kind of person who enjoys learning through reading, who enjoys stories, who like studying by themselves and being immersed in the language, we seem to have created a world of materials and courses and books and things that allow the right kind of person to just be in their element and learn very effectively. So that's what we do.
A lot of people do hear about language learning apps nowadays, and they're the kinds of things that we see lots of memes about, or videos about, like you say, TikTok videos as well, about these kinds of things. Sometimes like saying how wonderful they are, sometimes kind of poking fun a little bit. In your opinion, do you think it is more important then to really go into depth with sort of reading, rather than just focusing solely on these language learning apps?
I think we have to ask the question, what are you trying to achieve? Duolingo has 500 million users. Granted, most of those will have probably opened up the app once and then not used it again, but many others use it on a daily basis and have 600-day streaks and things like that. I'd be comfortable saying that people who learn languages with apps typically do not get very far. And of the people I know who are very successful with language learning, they don't tend to use apps. So for me, the relevant part here is that effective language learning is all about depth of focus. The deeper you go into the world, the more you can immerse yourself in the language, the more you can focus, the faster you learn. It's as simple as that. It's why I generally advise people not to learn 2 languages at the same time. It's not that you can't, it's just that it splits your focus. And if the question is, how do I learn a language effectively and actually learn to speak it, then the answer is focus very deeply on one thing.
Yeah.
And allow your brain to move into that world. The fundamental drawback with language learning apps is that, number one, they're on your smartphone, which is just death to focus. It's just distraction central. It's not good for anybody. And number two, being mass market, they typically take the approach of here's how to make a language quick and easy in bite-sized chunks, which of course it's not. I think for me, reading really offers the complete opposite of that. It's an opportunity to focus very deeply on the kind of activities that will result in you learning the language. And so that's the real benefit, I feel.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here and say there'll be people out there thinking, okay, Olly Richards, you've learned all these languages, but I mean, it's obviously because you've got a natural talent for this. You found it when you were 19, listening to these things, tried it out and it worked for you and you got into it and you do it. But can this reading and can generally just learning languages work for anyone and everyone? Or how much is this natural talent or experience that leads to almost a talent? How much does that account for being able to learn the language or read in the language?
I think it's foolhardy to say that there's no element of natural aptitude. I think we all have things that we're better at. And with that said, I remember when I was at music college, I think there's a lot of parallels between music and languages in terms of the amount of work and effort that's required. My experience across the board has been that yes, talent matters. Yes, talent helps, but it can only ever account for 5% of the outcome. The rest of it's 95% hard work. You take the most talented musicians in the world, they're still practicing 8 hours a day. If talent was the whole game, they wouldn't need to practice. And it's the same with language learning. Richard, I've known you for years, and one of the things that I notice, have always noticed about you, and every other one of my friends who is a prolific language learner, you're always learning languages. You're not sitting around watching Netflix. You're sitting up and you are studying and you're putting in the hours. So I think that you can say that talent makes a difference, and a natural aptitude for language learning helps. Okay, let's say that it does. Now what? What's next? What do you do with that information? You're going to give up? You're going to go back to the apps because they're fun? I feel with this question that it's one of those questions which cannot get you anywhere useful by asking it, and that really, if you determine that your life would benefit from learning a new language, we end up in the same place. It's like, which is focus, turn up every day, put the time in, stay positive, stay motivated, do things that tend to be more effective than not, and you'll get there.
And I mean, nowadays, how do you use your languages in sort of your daily life?
So when I first started with, obviously I lived abroad over many different countries. I taught English abroad for years, and those were my kind of language learning heydays. That was my language learning heyday. And then, but since having a family, life's changed quite a lot. I now live in the English countryside, in a very sort of whiter than white English monolingual environment, and which is lovely, but it has its drawbacks. One of which is you don't get a lot of language chat around here. So I'm finding a lot of my languages at the moment are really very much kind of locked up in the shed and don't get much of an outing. I often get the question, how do you maintain all of your languages? And the answer is I don't. I don't really worry about it, because language learning for me has always been a means to an end. I've always learnt languages so that I can communicate with the people around me. And so the last thing I want to do is sit up until midnight trying to desperately to maintain 8 languages for the sake of it. I know that if the day that I go back to Egypt, my Arabic will come back very quickly, and that's fine for me. And so that's the stage of life right now.
Fair enough. I mean, means to an end is not a bad reason to do things. I mean, talking about the kind of ends that have been for you, what's the whole language learning process meant to you? I mean, what have these ends gained for you in your life?
I ask myself that question sometimes, sitting where I am in the middle of a field right now, looking out at some sheep, and I ask, what was it all for? But the person I am today is a mix of all the, not so much the languages themselves, but of the opportunities that's given me. Living in the Middle East for 2.5 years, living in Asia for 4 years, being completely immersed in the music of Brazil and all this stuff. I can't. It's difficult to paint a picture exactly of what that gives me now on a day-to-day basis, other than that's the person that I've become, and I very much enjoy the fact that I can go on holiday to Japan, get off the plane, and speak with everyone in Japanese. We do it here at StoryLearning. We often do our team retreats in places like the Canary Islands, and take my whole team to Canary Islands and go out for dinner and order in Spanish. It's all good. I mean, it's not the soundtrack to my everyday of life, but it is very much the soundtrack to my overall life.
That sounds nice. Personal growth, personal development, but also adding that special je ne sais quoi to your experiences even to this day.
I think that's it. Yeah. And look, and this is just a moment in time. I fully intend to. I have my list. I have my bucket list of languages that's not going anywhere. I think we've talked in the past about how how kids can put that bucket list on ice somewhat. But I fully intend to live for another 50 years. I don't know about you.
Okay, I love that you mentioned this whole bucket list. So kind of, I do want to just sort of wrap this up with some really practical questions. So, Olly, I'm not going to ask you to tell the people who are listening what they should do. But imagine now speaking to yourself with your bucket list, and you're going to give yourself the top techniques, tips, tricks that you would recommend to start learning to read in the languages on your bucket list. Now, what are you going to do to start that process?
Step number one, go and buy yourself a good course. A textbook course, some kind of resource that's been created for beginners. Doesn't matter what it is, whatever you like the look of. Go through that from head to tail, maybe a couple of times, and just absorb it all. That will give you the foundations of everything you need to know in the language. Someone has done the hard work of gathering everything you need to know as a beginner into one place. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. Go and learn that stuff. Immediately after that, I would go out and gather as many different materials as I can that are suitable for learners that come with text and audio. So books of short stories, podcasts for beginners, YouTube channels for beginners, that things that have good material, whether that's stories or dialogues or whatever, that are written for people who are learning the language, stuff that comes with text and audio. And then I would just spend day after day after day reading that stuff, listening to that stuff over and over and over. As soon as I feel able, I would then look for material that I'm interested in. At the point that I feel ready and able, I would then start to speak, and I would get a tutor. It doesn't have to be like an expensive teacher, but just someone who I can speak to in the language. And then a few times a week, I would have a half-hour session, and I would just practice speaking in the language. And I just do that over and over and over and over again. And then from there, sooner or later, and it can be sooner with easier languages and later for harder languages, you then get to a point where you're able to start consuming real, quote unquote, real material in the language. So things that are intended for native speakers. And then at that point, I would spend as much of my time as possible consuming native speaking material. And really that's the end game, because then once you start to consume, once you can handle native speaking material, then you're off to the races, and there's no turning back. So that's it in a nutshell.
Well, I think that's a wonderful way to end today, to leave people with that little bit of a taster for what could come. Thank you so much, Olly, for joining me. I'm imagining that poor sheep looking back at you in the field now that you've just said that awful thing that you don't like gardening being in the green countryside of England. But all that aside, thank you so much.
It's been a lot of fun. Thanks so much.
A massive thank you to Olly Richards for joining me on the Language Podcast. Now we're comfortable with reading, the logical next step is writing. So that's where we're headed with Judith Meyer. Judith is the founder of LearnLangs.com, the Polyglot Gathering, and the author of the Teach Yourself series, Script Hacking. Subscribe so you don't miss that one. Get in touch with me and let me know what you've learned from Olly today. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye for now.